Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. If you were born after 1975, you probably haven't heard of the John Birch Society. In our next conversation with Dr. Matt Harris, we'll talk about President Benson's allegiance to this group and his strong anti-communist leanings. Check out our conversation. I'd also like to invite you to please subscribe on our website, gospeltangents.com/newsletter. You can sign up there and learn some more of the inside scoops and who we have coming up. So check that out, gospeltangents.com/newsletter. Now back to our conversation.
He meets a man named Robert Welch, who founds this very controversial anti-communist organization called the John Birch Society, named after a fallen GI in World War II, John Birch. And Welch organizes the Birch Society in 1958. And he writes an extremely controversial book that will get him just pilloried in the national press. It's called The Politician. He writes it in 58, but it's not published until 63. So it's this big, long manuscript that he shares privately with some friends. And Benson will get a copy of this manuscript before it's published in book form. And in the manuscript, it says that Eisenhower and members of his cabinet are communists. And he also said that Milton Eisenhower, the president's brother and close advisor, is also a commie. And he spells out several people. He says that the CIA director, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, they're all commies. And he gives several reasons why. Eisenhower doesn't curtail the New Deal policies. This is liberal New Deal, and of course, a lot of conservatives at the time thought that liberalism equated to socialism and communism. Well, one of the things that President Eisenhower doesn't do is drastically roll back the New Deal. And that leaves them open for criticism among people like Robert Welch. And there's some other things. Welch criticizes some decisions that President Eisenhower had made, General Eisenhower had made during World War II, and somehow that equates to communism. I mean, really some far-reaching here. Well, anyway, Benson reads this book, and he's absolutely electrified. That's the word he uses. He reads it, I'm electrified. That the man that I fought, or I served alongside for 8 years, has communist sympathies. It makes sense to me now. And he looks back at some of these things that decisions that Eisenhower had made, and he looks at those decisions and his 2 terms in office through the prism of that book. He is so enamored with this book, he sends a copy of the book to each member of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency. And
After it's published?
Yeah, after it's published.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So he reads it manuscript form, and then he sends them copies after it's published. And if you go to this day, the church library, the LDS Church History Library in Salt Lake City has copies of The Politician. Those are copies that he donated to the archives. Thought that it was important enough for the church archivist to have copies of this book. Anyway, so he sends copies of this book to each of the apostles. BYU has the letter to one of the apostles, Joseph Fielding Smith. It's open for research, so BYU has it, and he says, "Dear President Smith, here's a book." And anyway, it's a 1-page letter talking about this book will open up your eyes. And every church member needs this book. Anyway, Henry D. Moyle is in the First Presidency when this letter is sent out. He's a Democrat. And Hugh B. Brown's a Democrat, too, the other counselor at the time. You can imagine they're just mortified over this. Here's a moderate Republican now getting accused of being a commie, a 5-star general who spent his entire adult life fighting communism. And now his erstwhile cabinet secretary accuses him of being a commie. And Moyle calls him in. He calls him Taft. Moyle called Taft in, and one witness said, quote, he ripped Taft, ripped him. And one of the things he said was, how could you be disloyal to President Eisenhower like this? And you can imagine that as he's sending this around, his son, in the meantime, joins the Birch Society and becomes a high-ranking official in the Birch Society. He's the National Communications Director, I think is one of his titles. And he's going around giving speeches to Birch audiences, both in Utah, Idaho, actually one here in Denver, Colorado. And he calls President Eisenhower a commie. Out in the open, the news media is there.
Benson
Reed Benson, I'm sorry.
Reed Benson.
Reed Benson, yeah. Ezra's a little more circumspect. You know, Elder Benson at that point knew that it probably wasn't good karma to give speeches, and so his son would do that. But he did. But Elder Benson did get himself into trouble. In 1963, he spoke at a dinner in California. It was the 5-year anniversary of the Birch Society, and they were there to honor Robert Welch, the creator of this conspiracy theory. And President Benson, or Elder Benson, went to President McKay and said, "Hey, do I have your permission to do this?" And this is before it really got controversial, and President McKay said, "Okay, fine." And so Elder Benson, he gives the speech, and he says, "I'm here tonight with the support and consent of the president of my church, David O. McKay," giving the impression that President McKay supports everything he says. And in this speech, he talks about what a great hero Robert Welch is and how his views and his analysis of the government is right on. He doesn't say anything about Ike being a commie, but he does say in the speech that there are conspirators in the U.S. government. He says this, that this government, this is like McCarthy-esque. We're full of commies, basically, is what he says, but he doesn't identify President Eisenhower. After the speech, a reporter comes up to him and says, "Do you agree with Robert Welch that Eisenhower's a commie?" That's a direct question, right? Deserves a direct answer. And Benson refuses to rebuff the thought that Ike's a commie. He sidesteps the question. He doesn't address it. And then the byline in the New York Times the next day is, "Secretary Benson won't rebut that President Eisenhower's a commie." You can imagine it creates a buzz stir in the church. Because, especially Mormon politicians, there were probably, I don't remember how many, maybe a half dozen Mormon politicians in Washington, congressmen, including a Democratic congressman from Idaho named Ralph Harding, who was set apart by Elder Benson in 1949 before Elder Harding went on his mission. And Ralph Harding said that Ezra Taft Benson was always my favorite general authority until he gave that speech. And so Ralph Harding, by this point, Benson and his son had been crusading heavily with the Birch Society. They had been given speeches in churches, LDS meeting houses, firesides. They had been in sacrament meeting talking about the Birch Society. I mean, really hard stuff. And it's creating a division in the church between Birchers and non-Birchers. Because if you're not a Bircher, that means you're probably a commie. And I know it sounds strange, but that was the thought that many people felt at the time, including even his colleagues in the Quorum of the 12, that if you're not with Brother Benson's mind, Harold B. Lee once wrote to his friend J. Willard Marriott, "You must be a commie." Oh my goodness. And I mean, a little facetiousness there, but Harold Lee put his thumb on the right thing, that you had to agree with Brother Benson, because he was in government, he was in D.C., he'd been around these people, and clearly we did have communists in the government. We know this now. So it wasn't clearly, entirely made up. But the stuff about Eisenhower is just off the rails. And anyway, so as he and his son and Cleon Skiles and another character, as they're going around giving these anti-communist speeches and Birch speeches in the church, Ralph Harding and other Latter-day Saints are feeling the effects of this. And when the New York Times publishes that byline that Secretary Benson doesn't rebut the charge that Ike's a commie, Harding is mortified. And he stays up all night reading the politician, and he concludes that he needs to do something about this. He wants to give a speech on the floor of the U.S. Congress denouncing Elder Benson, this man that set him apart as a missionary and his favorite general authority. But he also recognizes that this could be, you're not supposed to speak evil of the Lord's anointed. And he also recognizes the challenges of Birchifying the church. He's witnessed it firsthand. Other people have complained to him about it. So all that context. So he decides that he wants to denounce President Elder Benson on the floor of the U.S. Congress. He sends he writes the address, and he sends it to his stake president, Milan D. Smith. This is also Elder Benson's chief of staff when he was in the ag department years earlier. And he sends the other person he sends it to is Hugh B. Brown, who had long been at odds with Elder Benson and did not like, of all the people in church leadership, Hugh B. Brown did not like Elder Benson's crusading. And I want to be very clear on this. I can't find evidence that any of the colleagues in the 12 supports Elder Benson's crusading. They may be sympathetic to some of his views, but they do not like what's going on in the church as a result. And I want to be also clear that President McKay is an ardent anti-communist, but he doesn't like the Birch Society at all because, again, it's dividing the church. So anyway, Congressman Harding sends it to Hugh B. Brown in Salt Lake, and also Milan D. Smith, his stake president in Washington, D.C., who was the previous chief of staff to Benson. Both men read the address and give the green light. And I wish Milan D. Smith was still alive. You know, he's not. And as far as I know, he didn't leave any papers around that I could find. I'd love to know how he dealt with this, because he says, go ahead and give this speech, allowing this congressman to criticize his former boss and his ecclesiastical superior. So that's an interesting story. But Hugh B. Brown says to Ralph Harding, you could do the church a real favor by giving this speech. And Hugh B. Brown thought that he was frustrated because President McKay didn't do enough to rein Benson in. President McKay allowed Benson to address anti-communism, but at one point President McKay said, you know, you can address anti-communism, but just don't say anything about the Birch Society, or don't go to any more Birch dinners. But of course, when you're giving a talk on anti-communism to the saints in General Conference, when they hear an anti-communist sermon from Elder Benson, they're hearing Birch stuff. And you don't have to mention the word Birch, just know that it's Birch. Anyway, so Congressman Harding delivers this speech that takes several hours, and it's devastating. Both Reed Benson and Ezra are just devastated by this. They're upset, they're angry. And Ralph Harding was warned by President Brown, if you give this speech, I want you to give it, but if you give this speech, there will be brickbats. What he meant by that was, the saints in Idaho won't forgive you for this. And they didn't, because in the next congressional election he was defeated, and arguably because of that speech. And I should also tell you that Ralph Harding sends the speech to Dwight Eisenhower too, who's in retirement at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So Ralph Harding is the first person to apprise former President Eisenhower that this is what's going on with your former cabinet secretary. And this is where it really gets interesting. And so he's aware of this, but he doesn't reach out to Benson. You can only imagine that he's, how he feels, especially since he had been so loyal to Elder Benson, Secretary Benson, during the 8 years in the cabinet when farmers are throwing eggs at him. And now Benson's embraced the Birch Society. Well, anyway, Reed Benson gives a speech in, I think, July of 1965 in Denver, Colorado, just up the road from here. And there's about 700 Birchers in this auditorium at a high school. And he says very clearly that Eisenhower is a commie. He leans red. And of course, the press is having a field day. And one of the press corps approaches Reed Benson, who's speaking in his official capacity of the Birch payroll. And, did I hear you right? Your father thinks that Eisenhower's yeah, you heard me. Then why was he in the cabinet? For protective coloration. What does that mean? Protective coloration. Well, what he meant by that was the entire cabinet, they're all commies, except for my dad. He had to have a foil to not let everyone think they're commies, because everyone knows my father's not a commie. So it was for protective coloration. It was the kind of, And so the reporter, of course, this is a great story. And so they published it in the Denver Post. And the AP picks up on it, and they publish it everywhere, this story. And one of President Eisenhower's former secretaries who worked for him in Washington reads the story. And he Xeroxes the Denver Post, and he takes a red highlighter where it says, my father kept him in the was kept in the cabinet for protective coloration. He highlights that. And he sends a note the assistant sends the newspaper article along with a handwritten note to President Eisenhower. And he said, I thought you'd like to see this. Eisenhower comes unglued. right? That how could you, what's going on? In the meantime, Elder Benson's writing letters. We know this from Benson's FBI files. He writes letters to the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who thinks that the John Birch Society is this dangerous right-wing organization. It's dangerous. That's what he says in his private minutes. They're dangerous, which is ironic coming from the J. Edgar Hoover, who's incredibly conservative. But he thinks that the Birchers are too radical. And so anyway, Barry Goldwater, a very prominent, influential Republican senator, the presidential candidate in 1964, he thinks that the Birchers are radical. When somebody gave him a copy of The Politician, the same book that Elder Benson had shared with his colleagues in church leadership, Barry Goldwater allegedly said, "I'd burn every copy you have. Get rid of this book. It will ruin you." And so recognizing that calling a 5-star general turned president a commie is dangerous for one's political career. Anyway, so that's how radical the Birchers are. And so the story goes that Eisenhower and Benson, they do communicate over this. And when the news media breaks the story, Benson reaches out to Eisenhower first and says, "My son's been misquoted." And it's hard to keep that position when 2 weeks before Benson had written J. Edgar Hoover and suggesting that Ike's a commie. And Hoover even says in his writings, any man who thinks Eisenhower and his cabinet are commie, they have something seriously wrong with them. So Benson's trying to curry favor with Hoover to get support for the Birch Society. Hoover will have nothing to do with it. Anyway, so clearly with these private letters to the FBI director, that's where Elder Benson's heart is. And so he says he's been misquoted to the president, but the president's just frustrated, he's angry. And I'll just conclude the story here, but they send several letters back over the years, and finally Elder Benson's trying to get Eisenhower to understand how the Birch Society is a very legitimate organization. And he would oftentimes say in his letters to President Eisenhower, "I don't agree with everything they say. They are a good patriotic organization." And when he said, "I don't agree with what they say," he never said what that meant. He never said, I don't agree with them when they say that you're a commie. He never said that, because he believes it. And what's interesting is that I have their letters, and Eisenhower and Richard Nixon too, Benson will send stuff to former Vice President Nixon about the Birchers. And both these guys are really upset with Apostle Benson, Secretary Benson. And anyway, by 1967, there's no evidence that Eisenhower ever writes Benson back again. Benson will write him happy birthday letters and this sort of thing, but Eisenhower's done with him. He feels personally betrayed by his support for this right-wing radical Robert Welch and these conspiracy theories. And in 1968, when Eisenhower dies, the Desert News will approach Apostle Benson and say, "What do you think about President Eisenhower's death?" And he says that the world has lost a true American, a loyal patriot. It's interesting. I've been calling him a commie for the last 8 years, and now he's a patriot. And Francis Gibbons, that I mentioned a minute ago, he was the first presidency secretary for something like 5 LDS church presidents. So clearly Francis Gibbons, and he was later called in to be a general authority. I think he was a 70. But anyway, in his book on Elder Benson as part of that presidential biography series, he doesn't go into the details that I just shared. He didn't go to the presidential library and all that stuff. He didn't have the FBI files. But he did understand that Benson called Ike a commie and that he was a Bircher. And that 1968 statement where Elder Benson said that Eisenhower was a true patriot, Francis Gibbons commented in his book that was published by Desert Book. He said that was possibly Benson's way of trying to make peace with himself for questioning Eisenhower's patriotism. I thought that was a startling admission from a former First Presidency Secretary who worked with Benson.
Wow. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. In our next conversation, we'll talk about Ezra Taft Benson's feelings about Hugh B. Brown and civil rights.
And so Elder Benson's furious with Hugh B. Brown's General Conference talk, where the church is on record as supporting civil rights.
We'll have a transcript out shortly on this conversation, and you can purchase individual copies at our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. If you want to be the first to get a copy, please subscribe on our website for just $10 a month. I'll send it to you first as a PDF. Or if you'd like a physical copy, for $15 a month, I'll be happy to send that to you as well. You can get our transcripts at our Amazon.com author page. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you should be able to find a bunch of them there. Please subscribe at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview uncut. And for $10, you can get a PDF copy. We've also got a $15 tier where if you want a physical copy, I'll be the first to send it to you. So please subscribe at Patreon or on our website at gospeltangents.com as well. For our latest updates, please like our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And also check our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents as well. Please subscribe on our Apple Podcasts page at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, or you can subscribe on your Android device. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.